Amanda from Pontes Books, back with some more information about chapter 2. So in our last video, we explored the vocabulary word awful, and today we're actually going to be looking at a fun fact. So last time we went with a current event for chapter 1, and there isn't really a super relevant or any super relevant current events, but there is kind of what I consider to be just a fun fact from this chapter that relates to modern day. And that fact is acting like a fictional character. So in The Prince and the Pauper, in this chapter, Tom Canty is reading a lot about and hearing stories of princes and royals and all of those types of things, to the point where he actually starts to act royal. He starts to speak royal. He starts to carry himself in a different way. So what I wanted to explore was, is that really a thing? Is that something that people do as they read this fictional story and then they start to take on the traits of one of the characters? So in this picture here, I went with cosplay just because that's kind of a visual representation of, okay, I have this character, fictional character, and now I'm kind of putting myself in their shoes. It's really not quite the same thing, because unless they're actually taking on the traits of that character, they're kind of separate. But that was the best visual way that I could kind of represent this concept. So, did you know that reading a book told through the eyes of a fictional character can actually affect the way that you interact with the world? So there was actually a study that we'll talk about in this video that indeed does, I don't know if prove is the right word, but it does indicate that fictional stories and fictional characters can actually influence the way that real people live. So the study was the main study, if you do any research on this, comes from Ohio State University. And basically their findings showed that if you are reading a story, you can possibly take on some of those personality traits of the fictional character, and they refer to that as experience taking. So you're taking some of those experiences and kind of applying them to your own life and how you live your life. So some of the findings indicated, and we'll go into kind of the different research methods that they used, but you're more likely to take on this kind of experience taking if it is a first-person book. So first person is when there's actually like a character telling a story and the reader is reading it through that character's eyes. It was also more likely when the person who was reading was a part of the same group as the character. So in the study, the example of that similar group would be like attending the same university. So they're reading a story about a character who goes to the university that they go to when they're reading it. So they are more likely to do experience taking if they're part of the same group, or if they've read the story and they don't find out kind of that they're in a different group from this person until toward the end of the story. And I'll explain a little bit more what that means on the next slide. So again, they found that we merge our own lives with the character that we read about, and the specific things that they studied was the likeliness to go vote. So they had college students who were of voting age and who were registered to vote read, I think there were like 4 different versions of a story about a person who had these like boundaries to voting, who like overcame them and went to vote anyway. And so they had these different variables in the story, like some went to the same university as the people who they read and some went to different. But essentially what they found is that the people who read the story about the same university as themselves, after the election actually went, they came and circled back to these people and kind of tracked which ones voted and which ones didn't. And the ones who had this were in the same group as the character they were reading about, and the ones that were from a first person point of view. So instead of saying like Paul went to go vote, it said I went to go vote. Those people were much, much more likely to have voted. So that was kind of one of the implications. And they also did some kind of experiments related to people reading about people with a different sexuality or race than themselves. And so this is where that finding comes in, where it's like the people who are reading the story might not have been of the same race or of the same sexuality as the character they were reading about, but their attitude toward that person or that character or that group of people changed based on when that person's group was revealed in the story. So if the character was revealed as being a particular race or a particular sexuality early in the story, they were less likely to feel, I guess, empathetic or positive feelings towards that person if they were from a different group than themselves, if it was introduced earlier in the story. But if it was later in the story, like, they get to know that character, they really get to see what their personality is like, and then they find out that maybe they were a different sexuality or a different race than them, then because they already kind of know that personality, then they're still more empathetic toward that group that character represents, if that makes sense. They also said, or at least one of the implications of the study, is that something like this would be less likely with movie characters, because those aren't first person. You're not typically seeing the movie through the eyes of a character, but in books, you actually get to get into the mind and kind of into the shoes of that character. So that's where it happens more often. There was also one article that kind of pointed out the fact that they were curious about what would happen with video games, because oftentimes in video games you are playing through the eyes of the character, and if that affects how anyone lives their lives. This wasn't a part of this study, but that was just something that someone pointed out would be interesting to explore. So a couple references. There's the actual article itself is research out of Ohio State University. And then there were just a couple other articles of people analyzing that as well. So I thought that was pretty interesting, that indeed, when Tom Canty is taking on a little bit of the personality of some of the princes that he's reading about, that could really be a thing. All right, all for today.